Good morning. My name is Rodney Fong, President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, and I welcome you to our Wednesday webinar. We are very delighted to have Rich Hillis, the newly appointed Director of the Planning Department here in San Francisco. Director Hillis was with the Fort Mason Center for the Arts and Culture prior to the planning department. He was a commissioner on the Planning Commission for 7 years. And while at the Fort Mason Center, many of you probably saw the transformation that Rich really led, a revigoration of $60 million into that historic campus, bringing in retail, restaurants, nightlife, farmers market, and really became a center. And for those of you who remember what that was like before, it was maybe a little bit of a quiet area, but he has absolutely transformed that. And we're looking forward to his skills in being able to transform things like Fort Mason into the city. Prior to Fort Mason, Rich was the Deputy Director of the Office of Economic and Workforce Development and worked on many projects, including Treasure Island, Yerba Buena, dedicating 8,000 units on Yerba Buena Island itself, working on a variety of port projects and the Octavia Boulevard project in the center of the city. Prior to that, Rich was with the Rec and Park Department as the Director of Partnership and Property Management and held and ran all of the RFP process and concessions. So Rich has a deep background of the city in San Francisco from all sides, from the public sector side, from the private sector side, and the nonprofit side. Today is brought to you by our BuildSF community group out of the chamber. It is a group of architects, engineers, developers who have interest in seeing San Francisco continue to grow, to streamline the process. And of course, the planning department is a big part of that. Want to thank our sponsors, HOK and SOM, for being huge sponsors and great dedicated San Franciscans to the BuildSF program, but also to San Francisco. So thank you very much for your contributions and support. Rich, thank you very much for joining us. Here we are in COVID life. I know you took this job fairly recently, just a few months ago, but are well armed and had many years of actually watching and studying the ongoing efforts of the planning department. And so it's not new to you. Want to just maybe get some overview of where COVID life has taken us in a very short period of time, what your hopes and aspirations were coming in prior to COVID, but then also maybe what has risen to the top, to the surface as low-hanging fruit that we can do at the planning department to improve our city.
Sure. Thanks, Rodney. Great to be here. As you know, you and I sat on the commission for many years together in experienced some of the big issues that San Francisco is facing, and certainly housing and affordability in San Francisco was my priority coming into this job. It was something we experienced sitting on that commission weekly, trying to get housing built in the city, trying to get funding for affordable housing, trying to make the city more affordable and more livable. So that was my priority coming in pre-COVID. I think to a great extent that still is my priority. I think kind of the crisis we're facing has somewhat shined a light on the need for even more housing in the city and in the region. So that continues to be a big priority. And housing everywhere, as you know, we've built a lot in kind of the eastern side of the city in District 6 and District 10. And we need to build, frankly, everywhere in the city, on the west side of the city, in elsewhere, in different types of housing. Not just high-rise housing, not just kind of 8-story housing, but 2 units, 3 units, 4 units of housing throughout the city. So that continues to be a priority. I think that the crisis, that we're facing has definitely elevated some other issues, kind of the future of office and where we're going and what office space may look like in the future, and certainly retail. I think our commercial corridors have taken a hit, and retailers in general have taken a hit, and kind of how they work in the future and what those spaces that are currently kind of dedicated to retail look and feel like as we come out of this and as we experience life a year from now.
Mm-hmm. Rich, there's so many unknowns, so many things we don't know, what the downtown core will look like when shelter in place is lifted. Do you and with your staff really see this as an opportunity, although it's a little bit of a blind curve that we're coming around? But do you view that, and are you leading the department with a sense of opportunity to make this as possibly once in a lifetime changes for the better for us and to reshape San Francisco. Do you feel that way?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, at first, our priority is helping those, kind of immediately in need. The mayor announced the shared spaces program that's going to allow retailers and restaurants to take over some of the public space. So we're, first in that kind of crisis mode, but then looking kind of beyond that, a year out, 2 years out, 10 years out, kind of what this is going to do to cities and in the uses around cities. I think it's hard to quite predict where that's going. I mean, some have predicted this is the end of cities as we know it. Others have said this is the time where, cities need to continue to grow and expand and we need more density. So, we're not going to have the answers tomorrow, but we're looking to see how this is going to impact us in the future. And we're starting things like the housing element, which is really kind of our policy on how we develop and where we develop housing and the types of housing in the next 10 years. So certainly this crisis will have an influence on that work.
Yeah. I know we're in the middle of a crisis and still sort of in triage mode. But so many of the things when we look at reopening and re-engaging with our city, either as employers or as residents or customers, so many of the things seem to be design challenges. How we're looking at retail and how that might flow. We're looking at even traffic in some of the slow street programs. I'm curious if you're inspired by that, if we want to take advantage and pilot some of these things that may be necessities now and not necessarily luxuries, which are two different reasons to do something. For safety reasons is a different reason to do something. But curious if those conversations have maybe begun and maybe outside of the department, if they've come from a neighborhood commercial district that wants to activate but wants to bring it into the streets.
Right. Well, I think the shared spaces example is a good one and didn't necessarily bubble up from the city deciding that, but you're sitting on or chairing the task force that the mayor has put together about economic recovery. And I think through that effort, a lot of these issues have bubbled up and ideas have come to the foreground that are great and implementable. And it's sometimes the city needs to just kind of step back and actually just help implement those changes that commercial corridors and small businesses want to make. So obviously we have limited kind of public space. A lot of it currently is dedicated to cars and automobiles, whether it's traffic or parking. So I think this shared spaces idea is a good test to see how we can take some of that space back from kind of the auto-oriented uses, whether it's kind of on Divisadero, shifting that to one lane and moving the parking out and reclaiming some of that space, a pretty narrow sidewalk for businesses and restaurants. I mean, I think that's the type of design challenge we have and what we want to look at throughout the city. But I think we're counting on those who live and breathe those commercial corridors, whether they're small businesses, merchants, restaurateurs, to kind of help us figure that out.
That's right. I want to remind our audience that there is a chat room available here. And if you have any questions that you'd like to send Rich or myself, please feel free to do that. Also, you can find out more information about the Chamber of Commerce at sfchamber.com. Rich, this may be the toughest question I'm going to ask you. With so many small businesses maybe not making it, all businesses and nonprofits struggling, they're all having to cinch up their belts, and when we come back open, everyone's going to be lean and mean for a while. That part of the opportunity we talked about is new businesses potentially opening up in empty storefronts or collaborations of existing businesses. Can you talk a little bit about the long time conversation about streamline processing, the permit processing piece, and why it is, as we both know very well, so complicated and difficult to open a simple cafe in San Francisco or change a cafe to a bookstore. And I know that we both have ideas about trying to smooth that out. How can we, even in the interim, because we don't want to just let everything go and maintain some controls, but how do we, for the interim, at least for the next 24 months, help people get back on their feet, help people reinvest themselves into San Francisco, and through the permitting process, both planning and DBI, try to make that as smooth as possible.
Yeah, I think, this is an opportune time to look at kind of the procedures and processes we've put in place that make it so cumbersome to fill a vacant storefront. And the rules, are different depending on what neighborhood you are in. But I think we've got to strive to just make allowable uses allowed, whether it's a restaurant or a limited restaurant or a bar or a retailer or an arts use, and even expand those uses of allowable restaurants, but not make some a CU in one neighborhood and not a CU in another neighborhood. We know what makes a good commercial corridor. We see it. San Francisco is known for its neighborhood commercial corridors. To some extent, we just have to kind of get out of the way and let that process work. It should be a 30-day process from the time you apply to the time you're approved. So that's what we need to strive for. I think that this crisis has given us more momentum to actually do that. But I think that's where we have to get to. The rules are just kind of too convoluted throughout the city. There still is the ability to appeal or file a discretionary review if neighbors or merchants associations aren't comfortable with where a commercial corridor is going. But I think we've got to streamline that process and just make it a lot easier if you're an allowable business to just be able to apply and open and not jump through a lot of conditional use hoops.
Yeah.
Even expand the allowable uses. We know there are going to be additional vacancies, unfortunately. So things like nonprofit office space, there currently isn't really a definition about that. And clearly we want to keep our commercial corridors active. I mean, that's the kind of use you can envision being a conditional use, because it's somewhat out of the norm for a commercial corridor to have office space in it. But I think if you're a retailer or restaurant, that shouldn't require a conditional use. And even expanding what a formula retail use is. I know you and I sat on the commission, and I've seen formula retail applications, but of businesses I've never even heard of, because the definition is pretty strict these days, in that it's 11 stores throughout the world. So, a lot of businesses that maybe we don't consider formula retail or in our mind aren't formula retail, they're not the Starbucks of the world, get caught up in this CU process. So I think we've got to take a look at that too.
That's right. So many people have mentioned what the secret sauce of San Francisco is, that we are a city full of pioneers, problem solvers, entrepreneurs, and that it is full of creative types. And I think even from a permitting perspective and a zoning perspective, allowing that creativity to flow and not being in their way will help San Francisco, better than almost any other city in the world, be able to bounce back very effectively and successfully. Can we jump a little bit to transit, but then also we've always talked about the balance of transit, office, and residential. And if you're going to build more residential or if you're going to build more office and pack them in, well, you've got to have a place for them to live and sleep. And if you have a place for them to live and sleep, you've got to figure out a way to get them to the office. And this really turns into a regional question always. But your thoughts on, and maybe how COVID-19 displayed how the Bay Area, at least, maybe is totally not prepared for another pandemic like this. How we need to create jobs and long-term infrastructure projects. And just curious if the planning department yourself have begun to think about, hey, what are these projects that maybe seem too heavy and too large and are 20-year jobs, but right now we can sort of use those as stimulus pieces in infrastructure jobs. Any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that we've been working for a while on the Caltrain extension, the downtown extension in high-speed rail. Not sure if they're getting kind of additional traction during this time, but big projects that I think are critical and need to move and are the type of infrastructure projects that, one, will put people to work, but two, for our long-term growth are critical. So, focusing. It's going to be tough, obviously, trying to get financial commitments from the state or the federal government during this time. I mean, the city's budget has been hit hard, so is the state and federal budget. But hopefully we'll see activity, especially on the federal level, to provide funding for infrastructure that we can use for those critical projects.
Okay, and I know that we've been transit first focused city. I think still that is the right way to go. COVID may take a little bit of a dent in that, as people are hopefully not, but maybe nervous about getting onto buses. It does bring up a interesting temporary conversation about vehicular use, buses, muni, and parking. And we were in a position, I think, before of removing some parking and encouraging either rideshare, mass transit, bike riding. This may change for the time being, maybe not. Just curious your thought, if some of these streets remove parking, how do we compensate for that? How do we encourage other modes of transportation?
Yeah, and certainly, whether we remove parking, and reclaim that space for more public use, I think is a discussion almost corridor by corridor that we need to have. In some cases where there's 2 lanes of traffic, perhaps 1 lane could be removed and parking can shift out 1 lane. Because I know parking is always a hot topic, especially in commercial corridors. But I think we've set ourselves up fairly well with just having different modes of transportation, whether it's bike or electric bike or rental bikes, bike share, scooters, in providing those alternatives. So it's not either or, it's not either, muni or you're in an automobile. There's different ways that you can use to get around the city, in taking 2 or 3 of those to get somewhere. So I think that's been good in the fact that we've developed all those, and many of them were in place, kind of prepped us for this, that there are those different modes of transit and for people to get around. And I think we've got to continue to enhance those. Certainly, bicycling is a great option during this time. I think it'll continue to be after this. So promoting that mode of transportation, making sure it's safe, making sure there's access in our streets to do that, I think is critical.
And as you know, there's not one mode that works for all the time. Sometimes that means taking kids to school or a parent somewhere. So a little bit tough getting my mom on a bike.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And I've got 3 kids, and, I know I couldn't survive without a car, driving them to Mini Lovey or the Presidio or wherever you have to go for soccer. We're having this debate currently in the hub rezoning, where the parking ratios are down now to 0.25 to 1. So not a lot of parking, no CU to get above that, but there's still a push among many transit advocates to put that at 0. At the same time, too, we're requiring 40% of those units to be 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms, with the hopes that families can live there too. So, we've got to have that balance with the ability to have a car, minimizing it, but not eliminating it.
Okay, let me take one question here, and it's actually from our board chair, Melinda E. Franklin from United Airlines, and she asks, the homeless issue, it was here with us before COVID. When we get back out, it's still going on today, and it'll be there when we get back out. Thoughts about land use and thoughts about the homeless issue. I know there's a little movement to take on some of these sites that are maybe surplus sites, temporarily at least. But whatever we do temporarily ultimately becomes a permanent decision or a long-term decision. So we've got to act carefully. Any thoughts on that when we have a limited supply of real estate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously that's the long-term answer is housing and permanent supportive housing throughout the city. This Thursday, we've got Balboa Reservoir, which is a publicly owned site. That's going to be 50% affordable housing. I don't think any of that affordable housing is necessarily geared towards homeless, but that's the answer ultimately, is to build housing at all income levels, build housing that's affordable, build housing that's supportive for homeless and formerly homeless. So, I mean, I think there's no way around it that's the answer ultimately. There's a lot of steps in between there. It's complicated, as we all know, but that's ultimately where we have to get.
Yeah, and that's not just San Francisco, right, Rich? I mean, they were talking about all counties, and this is something you and I watched very carefully, of the amount of housing production, whether it was high-end or affordable housing, region-wide, and for the number of offices and jobs that were created in the peninsula, the very low number of housing units, especially for rent units that were created in the peninsula. Marin County is terribly low, pathetically low. The other counties are low, and I think by pure square mileage, San Francisco is on one of the higher, if not the highest, per square footage creators of housing.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're seeing, the state jump into these housing issues, is because, from a regional perspective, we're not doing enough to create housing. I mean, we can say in San Francisco we're doing a lot. We've clearly got to do more, but at the regional level, we're just woefully undersupplied for housing. There's some great bills moving through the state. I mean, one is would allow spaces that are now zoned for commercial, primarily retail, so large malls or big box stores with parking lots, to convert to housing. And I think that, coupled with kind of where retail is, could be a gold mine for the region, for housing throughout the region. Doesn't necessarily help us tremendously. I mean, there's a couple spots like Stonestown perhaps that could convert ultimately to housing, but there's some good bills like that moving through the state that could create significant amount of housing in the region.
Okay, we have a few more minutes here, and Rich, I'll let you read the question that is actually pointed to you from Cliff Waldeck. But while you're reading that, I want to just mention that the Chamber of Commerce is a member-driven nonprofit. Our existence is a result of your generous donations and membership. So if you're not a member of the Chamber of Commerce, please encourage you to. You don't even have to be a business owner to help follow and support the Chamber, who is always fighting hard to support the business community here in San Francisco. Did you get a chance to see Rich?
I did. Cliff's asking about my experience with you on the commission, and I learned a ton from you on the commission. I mean, I think you are a true champion of San Francisco, whether it's small businesses or residents. You were level-headed always in practical in our approaches. So I share a lot of one about your love for this city. I think it's a great place, obviously, but it needs to change, and we need to solve some of the big issues we have. So it was great being on the commission with you.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work together on that. Here's another homeless question. How will housing for homeless be paid for?
Yeah, and I think this goes not just to housing for homeless, but affordable housing in general, and how it would be paid for. I don't think there's one solution, but I think there isn't enough funding for affordable housing. We tend to rely, I think, too much on impact fees from new housing to fund affordable housing and homeless housing, which makes it tough then to build that new housing. I mean, we know our inclusionary percentages are high. They're some of the highest, I think the highest in the state, and they're scheduled to kind of tick up as we move along. But we realize that's an impediment to new housing being built. And we're in this cycle too, where we set it high during the good times, and then when no housing is being built and developers are struggling, we try to adjust it and bring it down so we can get development. So we need a more rational way to kind of peg what that inclusionary percentages is, and maybe it moves up and down, and maybe it's an independent kind of look at it, like by the controller. But we've got to kind of peg that number, and also not overly rely on new development to fund affordable housing. And that may mean revenue measures. I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to additional kind of taxes to pay for housing and affordable housing, because I think it's just one of the more critical needs we have in the city. I don't know if the political infrastructure is necessarily for that. but a regular source of funding for housing, I think is critical, and for affordable housing. I, for one, have worked, I worked on the Octavia Boulevard project for many years, which I thought was great. We tore down the freeway. We built half of those units as affordable. But some projects, like the old off-ramp on Octavia in Fell, were just completed as affordable housing last year.
Yeah.
And that land was dedicated and given to the redevelopment agency to build affordable housing on a decade or so ago. And it's a great site for housing. It's large, but there just wasn't the funding to get it kind of to the finish line. So I think we've got to have a discussion on funding for affordable housing.
Rich, I think that points to a larger piece of how San Francisco, and probably all large cities, are very reactionary to the problems that were of yesterday, which is good. But like the building of housing, we, in a perfect world, would just every single year, no matter where the economy is, ka-chunk, 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 keep a steady pace, infrastructure on transit, ka-chunk, 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 and we won't get caught in these lulls of economic cycle.
Yeah, we definitely.
Not sure how we do that, but that's the ideal
Right.
situation.
Right. I mean, I think the city was good, and so was the state, and actually setting aside funding and having rainy day funds and reserves. I know it's kind of the first time that in my kind of 20 years with the city that we had that substantial reserve, and the state had one also. So that's good. But I agree, we've kind of have to get out of this kind of boom and bust cycle when it comes to revenue sources in building housing.
Okay, we're just going to kind of wrap up, Rich. If you can, explain how the business community, small businesses, medium-sized business, big business, large employers who have so much at stake here in San Francisco with themselves and their employees, help the planning department, help Rich Hillis achieve what he needs to achieve to make a better city.
Yeah, I mean, give us your ideas. I am a huge advocate of talking to communities, talking to stakeholders, to figure out where we're going in what we're doing. It's not just the city that's coming up with these ideas. I think that was evident in the task force and these ideas around shared spaces for retailers and small businesses. Again, back when I was the project manager for Octavia, those ideas all emanated from the community. I mean, it was ultimately a ballot initiative that led to that, but things like putting a skate park under the freeway, which I think was a great idea, came from the community. How we build housing on small, narrow sites came from a design competition with the architectural community. So we're looking for ideas. I mean, just the other day, I was talking to someone, I won't mention his name because he'll probably get killed if this idea got out, and what was his name? But he said, why don't we take Sunset Boulevard and use some of the open space along that road for housing? I mean, it's a nice, beautiful boulevard, and clearly there'll be issues with neighbors there, but it's not the most, robustly used open space in the city, and it's 16 blocks long. I don't know if that idea's got traction or not, but I think those are the types of things kind of we need to hear from the community and vet.
Yeah.
That's where some of the best ideas come from.
Yeah, I think we're at a place where there's no bad idea, there's no idea that's too large or too small at the moment. And if it doesn't happen immediately, it may happen down the road. There have been a couple of mentions of the task force, and if I can, there's some questions about it too. So the mayor put together a task force, which is exactly 80 people from every sector imaginable in San Francisco. There are 4 co-chairs, Carmen Chu, Jose Cisneros, Rudy Gonzalez, myself. There have been close to over a dozen meetings thus far with individual task force members in small cohorts, 2 large open assembly type of meetings. All of those can be found on onesanfrancisco.gov, I believe. And you can watch some of the task force meetings online and see some of the materials. So I think what's coming out of that are some good immediate fixes, ideas, some mid-range ones where are 1, 2, 3 years out, and then some long-term ones that we're talking about as well. And hopefully this is a good start and impetus for a long run here together of building and creativity. Any last closing remarks, Rich?
Well, and definitely on that task force, we're looking at streamlining how we can approve housing. And I know there was a question about this on the chat, and cut through some of the process we have. I mean, just as an example, there was a project on Howard Street. It was 100% affordable, but it took advantage of both the state density bonus and SB 35 and got approved in 6 weeks. And it was, I think, 18 stories. So a significant project. It took advantage of state laws. There are other state laws moving through the process now that will expand kind of how those processes can work to make that kind of 6-week approval available to every code compliant project. But I think that's where we need to get to. Can we get there? I don't know, but that's where we need to shoot for.
Well, the Chamber's willing to help you shoot for that, Rich. Do whatever we can to help streamline, remove that red tape, get creativity going, get people back on their feet, get companies hiring again. So you are the right person for this job at this moment, and probably a great blessing that this came to you your way and you went after it at the same time. So I appreciate that, and look forward to the Chamber of Commerce working very closely with the planning department as we journey together in the new version of San Francisco.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look at sfchamber.com, please consider joining and take a look at the future webinars that we have coming up. We're doing at least 1 or 2 per week with different hosts, different guests. So please stay tuned for those. And thanks for joining.